Hi guys, welcome to the Be Strong Podcast, episode 1. I'm Kostoru, this is my co-host.
Tom Walker.
For those of you that don't know us, obviously we're going to give a bit of an intro about ourselves, but firstly, how are you getting on, Tom? What's going on in your life?
Not bad, I think we're just both recovering from the flu, aren't we?
Yeah.
I think I started first, and then I gave it to you, because we were all practicing full mount sequences, and it's gone around.
Yeah, so we're going to warn you in advance throughout this, you're probably going to hear outbursts of coughing, because we are both dying. But that's basically what you've got to put up with. So what we're going to do, for talking a little bit about us, obviously those of you that are watching this probably saw this on my channel, so I figured we start with Tom, because those of you who are not familiar with Tom, Tom is like the jits physio, but I figured I'd hand over to Tom for that, talk us a little bit about, firstly, what got you into your training, and your career path, and how you kind of ended up merging those two things to what you're doing now.
Yeah, cool. So, short story, really. Well, it can be a long story if we want it to be. So, I used to compete in loads of different sports, and then used to sprint, used to do things like triple jump, and I got sucked up into a sport when I was doing my first degree, which was skeleton bobsleigh, which is a sport I'm not sure you're familiar with, some people won't be, where you go down the icy tracks head first. And so after finishing that sport and realising I could do nothing with an exercise physiology degree, I got into physio, and I think it was like 2015 time I started judo, and I just got married and I needed something to get me out of the house. And I had this really weird moment and all this arrogance where after I'd retired from sport, I thought I'd be like a really good athlete. And I remember coming home and saying to my wife, like, you know, I think I could put a few years into this and I could be like a high-level judo athlete. And then I remember I went to my first class and this like 55 kilo brown belt just threw me around. So those hopes were shortly dashed. So I've been involved in jiu-jitsu probably since 2017. And then after I left the NHS in 2020, alongside that, I thought, why not merge those two things together? Because I don't, as you're probably aware as well, there's a weird culture in jiu-jitsu of injury and this
Yep.
old school approach to things. So I thought it'd be a nice thing to direct the two things that I'm really, really passionate about, which is my profession and also jiu-jitsu. And it's taught me some really interesting things and picked apart some old myths that I maybe used to believe about the sport and also a lot about recovery. And then threw it all together, and then I just happened to be hoarding most of the jiu-jitsu athletes in Yorkshire now for physio.
Yeah, I was going to say, you are like the jiu-jitsu physio, which I think we should make your handle, like the official handle, like the jiu-jitsu
yeah,
physio.
that's it. That's when you know it, isn't it?
Yeah, that's how you know you've made it. For those of you, obviously, that don't know me, in which case, I don't know how you found your way onto listening to this podcast, to be fair. But obviously, formerly MMA fighter, which I kind of stumbled into pretty much by accident. Was always a pretty nerdy kid, not very good at any sports. Started wanting to box, but my parents didn't want me to box. So my dad showed me the first ever UFC video to show me that grapplers beat strikers in his plan to kind of get me to do judo, which I did, but then ultimately found jiu-jitsu, Thai boxing, and started competing in MMA. So my dad's great plan backfired. After I retired from that, started training people for MMA, realised that I kind of prefer teaching the grappling side of things anyway, so now I'm a full-time jiu-jitsu coach. But one of the things I really noticed, we were actually chatting about before we went live, is that even if you take someone with relatively mediocre skills, but give them a shitload of strength, they can be a problem.
Yeah, man. Definitely.
You know, and when I moved up here, I was just working a regular 9 to 5, hated it. Ended up falling into a place that had a gym in the basement where I ended up teaching the PTs there how to box and grapple. They really enjoyed it, talked me into getting qualified as a PT, and then here I am, pretty much. Obviously, speaking about you being the jits physio, can't actually remember who referred me to you. It was probably one of a long line of grapplers that had...
Yeah, it's been a weird little trickle-down thing, and I think it's really cool, because in physiotherapy there's a bit of a word-of-mouth thing, but I also... You can't be a specialist at something, I don't think, unless you do it, or you've got an awareness of it. We had someone a few months ago say to me, I've come to you because when I was seeing my therapist... Not as in psychotherapist, my massage therapist, they told me to stop throwing kicks in jiu-jitsu. And I thought, right, okay, but you get that reputation, don't you? And then it trickles down, and you specialise to some degree. Don't ask me to be a physio for football. It's not for me.
Well, I was going to say, like, in terms of picking a group of athletes to to specialise in, you probably picked the hardest bunch in terms of disobedience, I would say.
Yeah, yeah, I think you're right, and I think, but I think the culture's getting better. So when I first started jiu-jitsu, my coach for the local ones will know of a guy called Andy Williams who ran Nova Vida Jiu-Jitsu. Andy's very old school, and I remember some of the stuff when we were training. It's this like, get your head down, just keep going, keep pushing through it. And then I started to find, especially 4 or 5 years ago, just after I got my blue belt and I was starting to roll and be a little bit more aggressive, I kept breaking my toe. This is so frustrating, and I kept turning up and trying to do sessions, but I just couldn't put in the performances that I wanted to put in. So it kind of changed my perspective on injury prevention and maybe boxing off certain components of the sport that we do, so we can get better in other ones when we're injured too.
Yeah, well, I think that's it's got to be pretty much the biggest challenge for you now. Because anyone watching this that's a jiu-jitsu athlete, or even like say an occasional participant, will have no doubtly done the jiu-jitsu thing of like, oh, that hurts, I'll just tape it up a bit, or or I'll train light is another one, which is obviously never the case. You tend to go in there, have a roll or two, feel like you're alright, and then
the escalation starts where I'm a bit injured, do you want to have a flow roll, and then they'll give something, and the next thing 3 minutes and you're tearing each other's head off again.
Pretty much. Yeah. And in terms of prepping for like things like that, in terms of prepping for activity in general, we got one of the questions that came in. It was specifically for running, but I suppose we can broaden that to all sports in general. It was basically go-to warm-ups for running, right? Right off the bat, if I'm tackling that, I would say that I'm probably the worst person to ask, because in terms of warm-ups, I'm the worst. Like, before competition, I hated warming up, and that was very much a mentality thing of, I'm worried I'm going to get tired. I think it must be a Thai boxing thing, because I was speaking to Nicola Kay about this before her match, and she didn't do any warm-up either. She's very much like, oh, I'm worried I'll get tired, so they want to save all the energy. Obviously leads to more risk of injury. So if I was going to put my PT hat on and give you some wise advice when it comes to running, that is also consistent with how I approach things, which is to not warm up. It would simply be to do the exercise at a low intensity. So start with a very slow, ample pace that you can keep up. And obviously, if you're doing a competitive run, that's not ideal. So in which case, you want to get everything mobilized. My opinion on that would be basically anything that heart rate up, get the muscles warm, a few like dynamic stretches. But in terms of your opinion on it, because obviously I know that you're going to approach that with a much more wise viewpoint than myself. What would you say in general, like for running specifically, or just in general, any kind of sport that involves forward locomotion?
Yeah, so I mean, if you think about running, some of the more like advanced runners that I might see, because I'm not just a jiu-jitsu physio, if you come across like the A drills and B drills before and those sorts of things, so just replicating similar things, lower intensity versions of the activity you're doing, but considering things like your ground contact or implementing some drills. I always say, and probably similar vein to you, is I think you should approach it with lower intensity, especially if you're doing like a steady state thing.
Yeah.
A few years ago, back when I had my physiology hat on, your heart rate, and as you know, when you start running, you suffer for the first few minutes.
Yeah.
And then you normally find at about 8 to 10 minutes your heart rate will attenuate. And so my approach to things generally is I think about that rule is grade the activity slowly. So I'm getting into that activity sort of 5 to 10 minutes and I feel comfortable in that area.
Yeah.
And then I know I'm ready to sustain that performance.
It's the best way to approach it, and I would, like, if I was going to give some good advice that you could take away from this, probably don't approach it like I approach it, which is just to go out and do it, So like if I'm going to, I'm notorious for this. Like if I'm doing say 5 working sets of squats, I tend to not warm up. I tend to just rack up the bar and go, which obviously isn't ideal. Until recently, obviously, when I inevitably had some injury that had caused through some way or other, probably by doing that sort of, and now I try and do a couple of light sets prior. but I have been injury free since, so I can't really complain. One of the other requests that came in, figured I'd tickle this one. This one would tickle me, so I figured I might as well put this out there. Was to tell a joke, in which case I came up with what I thought was fitting, being a dad joke. Don't know if I told you about my obese parrot died.
Did he? What happened?
He just got old, but if I'm honest, it's just a huge weight off my shoulders.
Yay!
But that's what you're getting for the day. I'll probably bust another one out at some point. Also, what I wanted to pick your brain on, something that I'm pretty excited to get involved in as well, Broken Mat. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, cool. So Broken Mat is a bit of a brainchild of seeing what we've seen for the last sort of 2 or 3 years with a lot of grapplers and a lot of people who train, some S&C coaches I've been speaking to. Biggest problem in jiu-jitsu is training volume and also moderating your intensity. If you were to go and lift weights 5-6 days a week, you won't be going for 1 rep maxes 5 or 6 days a week, and we all feel that. So the purpose of Broken Mat is, the primary purpose of Broken Mat is so I can train on extra around family and work commitments. But the secondary purpose to that was I was thinking, how can we implement something where people can train at a lower intensity but not miss out on some of those learning fundamentals? So Broken Mat, bit of a plug here, Sunday nights, 8 p.m, Murfield.
Get yourself down.
Is essentially, it's treating people like adults. Because we know sometimes in jiu-jitsu, certain clubs have certain cultures. You might have some clubs who go hard and train really hard. Like I remember when I used to do judo at Bradford Judo Club had some really tough randori, and that's what it was known for.
Yeah.
Whereas you can go to another club and have lighter sessions. So the culture of this club is you come, you train, and you get what you want from the session. So check your ego at the door, and I know everyone says that, but if you turn up and you say, I'm going to train at 40% today, stick to it. And the second principle of Broken Mat is you can't win a roll.
Yeah.
So if you leave that session thinking, I've smashed everyone in there, you're missing the point. And so it's there for technical development. It's there to get an extra hour or 2 on the mat with a very low physical cost. Because a lot of the things that I might see in clinic is, it as a coach, you have people come in, they're dead excited about training jiu-jitsu, and then they're turning up to 5-6 sessions a week.
Yeah.
And then after 2 months, you never see them again because they've got some inflammatory sort of shoulder issue or back or neck issue. So for me, like we think about with personal training, it's about having that consistency rather than just constant intensity. And so that's what it's there for. So everyone's welcome. But the main principle of Broken Mat is there's no masters there. It's just a case of we all learn from each other. And if you have a good roll with someone and they beat you up with a technique you've never seen before, you've got the space to just go aside and say, let's work through this together and implement that.
Yeah. And I think it's pretty important to have an environment like that, because like I said, there are gyms that are known for having like very intense rolls.
Yeah.
In which case, you get people that are maybe not 100% fit, for example, and you got people that are peaking for competition. You put them in this environment where it's always 100% intensity, and that person that's not peaking is at a pretty high risk of getting injured. In which case they'll rock up at your door at no point, at some point. But yeah, giving people an environment where they can train, like you say, like adults, without trying to murder their training partners and without trying to break all their toys.
But I think that's the point you made, isn't it? If you have someone who's a high level competitor and they expect everyone at the club to train that intensity, and then you've got Barry who started jiu-jitsu 2 weeks ago and hasn't trained since he quit rugby 15 years ago, you're going to see a different level of response to the system, right?
100%. And that's the thing. I think that's one of the things we were talking about when I was studying to become PT. One of the things I said in terms of high risk for injury, one of the highest risk for injuries is your typical dad that has a son that's at college age and starting to get into athletics, and the dad starts to train with his son and thinks, I can still lift like I could when I was 20, and puts his back out, doing like deadlifts or something like that. Which obviously I 100% intend to do at some point with my little one when he's lifting.
That's the plan really for me as well.
Yeah.
We'll have a cough break. How long have you been holding that one in for?
That was pretty dedicated effort to hold that in. And also, I've got to thank Tom for this. He's got me some Lilt, which is, in my opinion, that's a god tier drink.
Well, let's talk about Lilt for a second. Did you know they're getting rid of it?
You know what? Someone mentioned this the other day.
I hear it's either being discontinued or will be rebranded as like Fanta Lilt. Either way, I'm not happy, so I might stockpile some Lilt.
Yeah, that's a part of my childhood.
Yeah, I feel that way. I feel that way.
I felt like that, and I still feel like that if I do manage to track down a wagon wheel and I see what they've become from what they were.
Jammy or marshmallow only?
You know what? I went through a period where I was well into the jammy ones.
Right, okay.
But I think the classic ones are...
You matured.
Yeah, I think I've got... Like, my palate has gone back to like, what it was. But I remember them being like some huge thing when I was a kid. And let's do it now. It's just like... this sad
one
little,
mouthful.
Yeah, you can... That's like a one bite. You know,
and the other thing I missed... Do you remember Tizer? But original Tizer.
That was the nuts.
Back when the E-numbers were in there.
Yeah,
that was the good stuff.
That's like the... what was it called? Was it Jacked 3D? The good old
the university studied.
Yeah. The pre-workout with amphetamine in it. That was another good one. It does make you think about the supplement industry as a whole. If they're managing to put out pre-workout stuff that has amphetamine in it, it's probably the least regulated market in general. To the point where I recently ordered a big tub of protein, which, you know, protein you can't really go wrong with. But they sent me a free shot of pre-workout, just a little one shot.
Yeah.
And it's still sitting on the side there waiting for me to drink it because part of me's like, I don't know what I'm going to get with this. You know, this could be like one shot and I'm like on cloud nine, or it could be like just a dud.
You know, More Plates, More Days?
Yeah.
He's made his own pre-workout.
Oh, no way.
And it's called Gorilla Mind. And I had a client of mine bring me some to try. Long story for those on the podcast, I was raised a Mormon and I didn't drink caffeine until I was like 26 or 27, so I'm quite sensitive to it. I had 2 scoops of this pre-workout and it's got beta-alanine in it.
All that stuff, yeah.
So I've got itchy skin coupled with the caffeine, and I thought like my head was going to explode in the session. I had a great session, but yeah, quite intense. I think I can get by without pre-workout.
I still remember the first time I took a pre-workout. And it was one of those, like, I was like, I don't want to, like, I approached it, for me, quite sensibly. I was like, I don't want to take this for the first time before I lift, because I don't know how I'm going to react, and I don't want to be experiencing, like, a new thing.
Yeah.
Like, you know, when I'm going to lift, for example. I always say it to, like, someone asked me before competition, it's like, oh, should I take a shot of pre-workout? It's like, do you usually do it? And they're like, no. And it's like, then definitely don't. You don't want to be in competition the first time you try it. So I was smart. I was like, you know what? There's boxing on tonight. I'm going to be staying up late. I had a shot of pre-workout. I stay up till like 4 a.m, watch the boxing. Took the shot of pre-workout. 8 a.m, I was still up. Like, I sat there like buzzing. And I was like, right, this stuff is something else, you know.
Well, there was the first time I took pre-workout, because when I used to compete, I was on drugs testing a lot. So I just wouldn't take stuff unless it was like batch testing. So I didn't want to risk it. And I went to my friend in the gym, and he's brilliant, is my friend James, but he takes like 40 pills before he lifts weights. And I remember I took all these like just swallowing pills before I weightlifted. And we were going around to my girlfriend's house, which is my wife's house, and her parents were there. And I was so hungry, but they're notorious for very small meals. And I remember just being sat there, and I just relentlessly, forgetting all social convention, just went into the kitchen, just made like 4 sandwiches and just ate them all, like shaking from the pre-workout.
Like a champ.
Yeah, that's what you need.
Yeah. So like, if anyone's watching this and you have some of that old good stuff with like the amphetamine in there, just hook us up. You know, like, we'll be might as well like have a party one day and just like.
I'll sidestep this a bit. Have you heard of like Adderall and modafinil?
Oh yeah, all the American like is it concentration stuff, or is it like?
Well, so it's a drug. If correct me if I'm wrong, for ADHD.
Yeah.
But I have a friend who works for like all of these big companies like Tiffany, and you know, where it's quite a high demand job, and there's a big culture of where they take Adderall.
Yeah.
I also had another friend who managed to get his hands on modafinil, which they are amphetamines, and he had a really busy like time at work, so he said, I'll take some. And he took some. He said, for 12 hours, I was like wired, like focused. And then he said, I got into bed, and my brain just goes, nah, you don't need sleep. You're all good. So he spent all night just wide awake, ready to go.
That sounds like the good stuff. If I remember this rightly, someone out there can correct me if not, but isn't Adderall what apparently made Roseanne Barr racist? Like that one. Yeah, I remember she tweeted something I can't even remember what it was, but it was something that was like widely panned for being like proper racist.
Because she got banned for it, didn't she?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then her whole career came down.
And I think, if I remember rightly, I don't think this was like a cancel culture thing of like people like, oh, you can't say that's insensitive. It was literally like, I think she'd taken like a black politician and like spliced them with a monkey or something like that. It was something really offensive.
Right, okay.
And her excuse when it came out was like, firstly, it's like, oh, I didn't realise she was black. It was like, fair enough. And then she was like, oh, I've been up all night taking Adderall. And I think Adderall actually put a tweet out saying like, side effects of our product do not include racism, which I thought was like pretty good. But she tried to like absolutely like throw them under the bus with that, to be fair.
Oh, it's ridiculous, isn't it? It's crazy. So Jack 3D, amphetamines.
Yeah. So in fairness, leading that into one of the questions we got about what do you eat before a comp to prep yourself? Probably not amphetamines or anything like that. What I would say, if you're looking at it from my point of view, looking at the duration of like a jiu-jitsu match, right? Unless you have multiple matches throughout the day, which in some cases you will, depending on the size of your division and how well you do, you're probably not going to need too much in the way of like intra-workout nutrition. Like a lot of people that have a match and they get off and they want to like yam some food down because they're drained, but realistically for the duration of the match, you're probably not going to exhaust all the stores of like carbs and glycogen that you have in your body. What I would say in terms of what you're going to eat before a comp, the night before is probably going to be more important than the actual day of the comp. For the day of the comp, for me, it's all about routine. It's just I want something familiar that kind of keeps me like settles my mind. You know, something I want on comp day. I want everything just to run smoothly and be familiar. So I always have the same thing on comp day. I always have some overnight oats with fruit, some protein in there. You know, it's basically everything you need. The night before is where I'll tend to eat something a little bit more, I suppose, focused. But for me, it's always going to be the same thing. You know, anything you can find at Nando's is generally going to be all right. Some sweet potato, something, you know, some like easily digestible carbs that you can use for energy, and a pretty simple protein. Nothing that's going to upset your stomach. In terms of like energy demands for your match, like I say, you're not really going to need that much more specified nutrition than that, in my opinion. So I would just say to keep it simple, like stuff that you can stomach well. So the person that asked that said, I tend to just eat a banana, like, you know, like in between matches. That's not a bad shout. You know, it's pretty simple sugars that you can basically access relatively quickly. Yeah, so I'd say you're actually doing the right thing there. Just keep it simple.
Yeah, I mean, like the one thing I would add is from my experience is I've not particularly found the balance, I don't think, in some of like the jiu-jitsu competitions. The best competitions I've done is when I haven't cut weight and I've come midway into the division. And the worst performances is when I've cut weight and I've like gassed out in those competitions. But I remember I did a judo competition. I was meant to be in at 66 kilos and I just messed it up and I got down to like 63.
Yeah.
I remember just grabbing the guy's gi and just thinking, this is not, I'm so drained. But what I would say is, to add from like my experience competing in skeleton, is I was competing a lot and I was competing in a sport that's quite dangerous, obviously.
Yeah.
And you're very nervous, and I think the thing I always like to think is there's no magic. So I remember I used to wake up like when there was a season when I was doing something called like America's Cup, where I was in like Canada and Utah and all these different places. And I was like trying to play with my routine. I'd wake up in the morning, I'd go and do some stretching and yoga, like by this pool, and then I'd try and meditate between like runs, because it's obviously a high demand sport followed by that relaxation. And then I realised you've just got to find your routine. Yeah. And it's like what you say with the overnight oats, like there's no silver bullet in performance really at this point. And that was the one thing that caught me in skeleton out. I remember when I first started competing, I'm like, right, it's race day. We've all seen the films. Something magic happens on the day of the race and you find an extra magic something in the corner. It doesn't happen. It's just practice, process, routines. And so, you know, from some of the research we know and the types of demands that are placed in the sport is similar to you. Like you get easily accessible carbs before you go. Your energy system is quite complex in jiu-jitsu, but the last thing you want to be doing is depleting yourself of carbohydrates. Like in a sport like jiu-jitsu, keto is not your friend.
Yeah. And
so we just got to make sure we've got access to those stores, but it's, like you say, readily available. But the night before and the day before is really the key, isn't it?
Yeah, that's it. Because like nothing you can eat. Like, say you got 5 minutes between a match, nothing really that you can eat in that time is going to have any meaningful effect. It's just, it's like there's some tests, some research that suggested, like, when it comes to carbs, just having them in your mouth, because they're getting broken down by like amylase, I think it was. I need to refresh my memory on that. Can have a little bit of a benefit in performance, but you're talking like something that's so minute in terms of
carb rinsing. That's what they call it, isn't it? Yeah.
Like I think they tested it by swilling an energy drink and spitting it out.
Yeah,
and it's
yeah.
like, but again, that could just be the placebo effect of like, oh, I've had something nice in my, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
like, but then if a placebo if you perceive it as having a benefit and it has a benefit, then it has a benefit. It's one of those.
But I think what I find quite interesting about the culture is I've seen a change in the last 10 years in people who are hobbyists in any sport are very professional on how they approach these things now.
Yeah, yeah.
And, it's easy to get sucked into a culture of like, I need to get down to a certain weight because then I'm going to perform. But let's be honest, if you're competing at white belt and blue belt, the probably biggest differentiator is your skill.
Yeah, 100%.
But I think we often chase some of these really small incremental gains, and actually sometimes we just need to have confidence in the fact that we spent 6 months prepping for this event, right?
Yeah, 100%. And it's funny you mentioned that. I remember I was having this debate with a strength coach. It was about an MMA athlete, and we're talking about like benefits to increasing their strength. And my argument to it was that obviously it's always beneficial to be strong, right?
Yeah.
But when you've got like a high level athlete that is probably kind of nearing their strength potential,
Yeah.
So let's take the deadlift, right? Good lift, could benefit many things in terms of like the ability to create like a lot of power from your lower body. Let's say they have a deadlift of 200 kilos.
Yeah.
And they're quite near their strength potential. For them to increase that by 5 kilos might take a long fucking time.
Mm-hmm.
You're talking about like weeks and weeks of dedicated training to put an extra 5 kilos on the bar. Like when you start off, you could be putting 5 kilos on the bar like every few weeks. It's like, but then when those newbie gains wear off, it takes a long time. When it comes to especially a combat sport, so jits, MMA, I'd make the argument that you're getting diminishing returns. So like the extra 5 kilos on that bar aren't really going to make a huge make a huge effect to the benefit of the performance that they're putting forward, compared to something else you could do. They could spend that time increasing the skills that are going to have more of a carryover, And while I always make the argument that you want to be strong, you're going to get to a point that there are diminishing returns in terms of the amount of time you have to put in to get stronger to the actual functional benefits of that strength.
So there was a paper done, I think in 2015, profiling jiu-jitsu athletes from club level to elite level, and looking at certain strength parameters. And there's a few really interesting things between an average club level hobbyist and an elite level jiu-jitsu athlete. There's no significant difference in VO2 max.
It's mad, isn't it?
Another thing as well, like their back squats were, only just over body weight. Their grip strength wasn't outstanding.
Yeah.
It's all of these things where, like you say, how transferable is it to the activity? And I would say the way I think about things from my perspective as a physiotherapist is you train muscles and tissue for resilience, you train them for general conditioning, body armour, and then you will condition the muscle generally from doing the activities.
Yeah.
And like you say, the metabolic cost of trying to gain 10 kilos on a deadlift and the time that you put in, you could just go do another light session.
Yeah.
And you'll get better.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
So they always say it's the old boxing adage: skills pay the bills. So never forget that. Like in terms of your training and things like that, you want to be at your physical best in terms of as fit, as strong, as robust as you can be. But ultimately, if you have all of those things and you're not putting the skill work in, there's always going to be someone that's going to beat you. You know? It's like, and you can be a right pain in the arse if you don't have much in the way of skill, but you're very strong and you can shut someone down. It's a very frustrating experience to be in. But that said, ultimately, the more skilled athlete is generally going to take control of the match, as it goes.
And then like you take something like, let's use that deadlift as an example, because I think there's still a weird culture where, a lot of strength research has come from the 1950s and 60s in Russia from powerlifting and Olympic lifting.
Yeah.
And you know, Gordon Ryan talks about it, controversial figure at the moment.
Oh yeah, I have to go into that.
But like the big thing for him is isometric strength. He says that's what makes him so good at that.
Yeah.
And how many people do you see in jiu-jitsu actually practicing isometric strength?
Yeah, it's very few.
Yeah, and it transfers a lot more to the demand and the muscle activity than we would do from ripping a deadlift from the floor, right?
Yeah, because like when it comes to something like that, if you look at jiu-jitsu as an activity in itself, there's not that much of it that's spent on the feet generally.
No.
You know, so like there's a lot of exercise. If you look at like your lunges, you know, your squats, if your deadlifts, all like really good exercises in terms of like benefit that you can get from strength, coordination. But that said, most of jiu-jitsu spent without your feet rooted to the floor.
Yeah.
You know, so
it's an open chain activity,
yeah,
usually, right?
So it can like call into question like how much weight you want to put on these kind of things. But it's funny you saying when you're talking about like isometric strength, one of the questions that we had was asking about grip strength, which is obviously something that is very important in jiu-jitsu, especially gi, because it's tough on the hands, man. The question was, how do I get my grip stronger? So the first thing I would suggest, and the person that sent this in is actually coming to the seminar next week, Dan Strauss. Definitely want to pick his brain on, because he is a grip strength master. You know, he's known for his grip strength. In terms of activities that I like to do to strengthen my grip, I actually keep it quite simple. I like carries, loaded carries and things like that, and I like hangs, purely because it's not just about the grip strength. It's about like decompression when I'm hanging, you know, like shoulder health in general. When it comes to carries, if I'm doing like just like one side, for example, you're getting like a core workout at the same time. There's a lot of stabilizing muscles, so you're getting a lot of bang for your buck. You're doing an exercise that will cover. You get your benefits in a lot of areas, as well as the primary area, which is strengthening your grips. I see people doing loads of crazy things like towel chin-ups and things like that, and I do enjoy doing those for the novelty value, but it wouldn't be something that I particularly would do as a specific thing for every workout. I tend to prefer the carries and things like that. In terms of your own experience, if you're trying to strengthen your grip, what would your go-tos be?
I think considering like that there's a few different gripping patterns that your body can do, because they talk about a spherical power grip, you can talk like about a pinch grip, a crimp grip, so there's various positions. I'm more on the lines of your thinking in terms of like what's the biggest return. If you're, let's use that deadlift as an example, if you're ripping a deadlift off the floor, you're not going to have problems with your grip.
Yeah. You've
got sufficient grip to do what you can for the sport. The issue a lot of the times is muscular endurance. And so one little circuit I have, and this is just purely anecdotal and use a lot of guys, is I get a kettlebell and I'll grip it in the open palm position. I'll grip it in like a pinch grip position, and then I'll also get a plate, like a 20 kilo plate, and do like a C grip.
Yeah.
And just alternate between those three to try and hit those different groups, because there's various different muscle attachments for your grips in the hand, and I'd find generally they cover it. But what I do is it's almost like a circuit where I can get through it in 3 or 4 minutes.
Yeah.
Because one question, and I liked it from one of the courses I had, we were talking about like range of motion conditioning, and someone wasn't quite getting on the course. We're like, well, how many sets and reps do I need to do to get the desired return? And you could see the instructor on the course was getting a bit frustrated. He's like, just quit your day job and do them all day.
Yeah.
You know, if you want the best returns, do them all the time. But the biggest question we have in both of our professions is, how much time can you actually give to this?
Yeah, that's it.
And then we can do some stuff with that.
Yeah, I get that a lot, to be fair. When people are asking about programming and stuff like that, like, oh, I want to do this, and I want to increase this, I want to increase this. It's like, okay, cool. You know, how many days are you looking to train? It's like twice a week.
Yeah.
It's like, okay,
cool.
You're going to need to narrow this down a little bit. You know, because like each of these things that you're wanting to do, they're going to take a lot of time. You know, and like if you've got 2 days a week, there's no chance that you're going to be able to like make significant gains in any one of those areas. You know, it's like you're basically, you've got eggs in too many baskets. You know, you need to basically narrow this down. So a lot of it does come to how much time can you put into this. You know?
Well, it's the thing as well. I think that it's the Eddie Bravo culture, where jiu-jitsu athletes want to be like super bendy, and also want to be super strong, and have a high amount of technical knowledge, and also be injury-free. And those, unfortunately, performance and health don't coexist.
Yeah.
And like you had when you came to see me, one of the things you came to see me was we needed to work specifically on the hip mobility.
Yeah.
Not because I'm trying to get you into the splits, because you lacked the ability to get into a certain position.
Yeah.
And it took a lot of time to get that back, right?
Oh, yeah.
So imagine if you apply that to 7 or 8 joints.
Yeah, exactly.
You're playing a game that it's not worth your time.
100%.
Why don't you develop your skill set around that?
Yeah, that's it. And that's the thing. Like, a lot of the time, your game in jits kind of finds you based on your physicality. Like for me, I used to try and like play a lot of rubber guards. Believe it or not, because I saw that Eddie Bravo did. I was like, oh yeah, I want to learn some of this. And I was never very good at rubber guards. I did alright with it, but it got to the point where I basically had someone in rubber guard. They postured up. And then, like a meathead, I just grabbed my own foot and pulled them down, and like done a partial tear of my own LCL.
Yeah.
And I realised, like, there's probably better guards that I can be using for my own physicality, And obviously, I, funnily enough, found my way into butterfly guards a long time ago because I was rubbish at leg locks, and I found that if I played open guard, people would just grab my foot and drop back. But when I hid my feet, then they couldn't footlock me.
Yeah.
And I was like, right, I'm going to start playing butterfly guards, and then it turned out to be my favourite guard. Because like I've got a decent amount of like bridge and lift strength in my legs, and I can turn people. But again, it's just like that was my body type, and I was trying to play something that probably wasn't ideal for my body type, my level of flexibility. And then when I started playing to my strengths, you notice like huge bounds in terms of like where you're actually getting with your technique.
Yeah, and the simple thing we think about with an injury, right? It's not overly complicated. The reason you get an injury is you have a specific joint capacity, and when that joint capacity is exceeded, you get injured.
Yeah.
So, we can either work our way around that and find different ways of moving people, or we can strengthen that joint's capacity. Like, those are your two options, really, aren't they?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just a long road if you want to become a bendy boy in your mid-30s, right?
Oh yeah, it's tough. So for anyone that's young watching this, keep what you've got. Don't try and get it back when you're older. Like, stay mobile when you're young. Because I was a young meathead once. I wasn't bendy, but I was more bendy than I am now. And I remember taking it for granted. Like, I can always do this, And take it from a now more seasoned, older grappler. It's much easier to keep the level that you have from when you're young than to try and get it back when you're older.
Yeah, and I think another thing, like, which is really neglected in the strength and fitness industry is like having fun, like being a kid, playing around, because a lot of the times we're not. You'd be doing silly rolls. You'd be trying. I remember when I was competing in skeleton, I'm like, I'm going to learn to do a backflip, and taught myself how to do a backflip.
That's pretty sick, to be fair.
Because I think having fun, jumping off things, like doing silly bounding, that keeps your athleticism. We all get very, very heavily focused on getting into the weight room and lifting heavy shit. But you can be so much more athletic if you just play around a little bit.
Yeah.
And I think we lose that as we get a little bit older.
Yeah.
Whereas my 5-year-old will just find whatever she can and jump off it at the greatest height she can.
Yeah.
And that's why she's a little bit springy and athletic. And also she's 5 because
there is that.
Her body's just so resilient.
Ah, God, the good old days, isn't it?
Yeah.
But to be fair, a lot of people watching this are going to be looking forward to Broken Matt because they are not young and not and not as supple as they were, which is obviously another great reason to put it on. One of the questions that came in, which I thought was a great one to field, especially with you here, was: is it normal to feel deflated and feel like you're getting worse when you can't roll due to injury? So obviously there's a lot to unpack there, but first looking at it from like a perspective lens of time off rolling hard rolls particularly. So this person's still training classes and stuff like that and drilling, but can't really do too much in the way of sparring at the minute. So in terms of like, obviously both of us have been recently or relatively recently injured. So you want to tell us a little bit about your experiences with it, your own kind of mindset when you're going through it, balancing that with what you know from a practical sense of like needing to let your injury recover. So I think the thing for me is there's always like a real frustration with an injury, right? Because you never expect you're going to get injured. So you've got all these plans. So I had 2 competitions booked. I was ready to go into this year like super pumped and start tearing through some comps, and I'm unable to do that now. And there's a frustration that stems from that. But then
I find that, I don't know about you, I have a weird thing when I have an injury where I get a frustration, but also like a sense of reflection, and I can go through that process and go like, right, what can I get a little bit better at? Or when it backsteps my ego a little bit.
Yeah.
So when I started to recover a little bit, I mean, I'm still not 100%, but I'd say to training partners, can we just go like steady away, and we'll focus on some of these components. And I think the biggest evolutions I've had in my own jiu-jitsu have come from injuries. So, like I said, I kept breaking my toe. I developed a really good guard game when I, 4 years ago or so, where, because I couldn't do anything on my toes, I was on my back.
Yeah.
And I'm like, right, I'm just going to get really, really good at this process. And if I can develop almost like a bulletproof wall around this one component of my game, they're in trouble when I'm better.
Yeah.
And so I think from a perspective, it's, firstly, you're not going to get better quicker by training hard. Like, that's just the reality of things. There's nothing you can do to speed up your body's process. You can optimize it to some degree, but ultimately there's no machine or weapon in the world that will speed your healing up faster. You need to respect that process. And then it's about knowing where your limit is. Shameless plug about physio, but sometimes you'll need someone else to tell you what those limits are, but also you need someone to tell you what those limits are based on their understanding of what the demand is.
Yeah.
Because my real challenge is, I hate to be that person who tells someone not to train, and I'll only do it unless I absolutely have to tell them to do it. But I feel like I've seen a fairly few, high number of quite high level jiu-jitsu athletes who, I'm like, you can try some positional sparring in this position, you can try, exposing yourself into this position, you can do some light rolls, pick a good training partner. But also it's about that conversation with your coach and just saying, stop trying to impress them by trying to smash everyone at training and say, I'm injured here. Like I said at AVT, I said to Jay, I'm just going to have some light rolls just because my ankle's hurting. And then you everyone's on board with that. Your training partners are your friends, right?
Yeah, 100%. And it's like, in terms of like the mental for it, obviously when I can't train, I do feel very frustrated, do feel a bit deflated sometimes when I go back into training. And the best example I can give of this was actually not through an injury. So it was during lockdown, right? When I didn't realise that people were rolling still.
Yeah.
Until about 4 months in, when I got a message, and one of the guys I trained with just asked me, it's like, oh yeah, who's in your rolling bubble? Like, where are you rolling? And I was like, you guys are still rolling? Like, get me involved. And I got, this was probably like 4 or 5 months into lockdown, so I'd been off grappling for a while, and they'd been grappling the whole time. And when I got there, I was just getting smashed, like really badly. And I felt deflated then. I was like, I've lost this. But things always balance out. So now, I'm back to being the hammer rather than nail in those kind of situations. But it is like, the best advice I can give when it comes to that is that everything is temporary. So you have a period in time where you're not training as much, and you might see that relative to your training partners, that your skill level decreases a bit. And this might not even be that your skill level is dropping off. It's just people are still training and they're going to be a bit sharper. But once you're ready, your skill level will come back up. It's one of those things that you will get a bit rusty, but ultimately it's all short-lived. It's not permanent. So if you get in the mindset that, okay, I'm going to be a bit rusty because I haven't trained for a bit, I probably am going to be the nail for a little bit, against guys that I was like chewing up a couple of months ago. If you can get that kind of ego aside to the point where you realise, okay, I am going to be the nail, this is how it's going to be, but I will ultimately get better and I'll be back to normal, then you'll be fine. It's just approaching it from the right mentality and realising that, you're not going to pick up where you left off, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. You can develop a lot of other areas of your game around an injury. So like Gordo basically popularised the half guard through a knee injury.
Yeah.
So that the story, he couldn't play full guard because he'd smashed his knee. So started playing half guard, and that was like, back then, half guard was basically thought of as half mount. So I remember Ben Popperton saying in one of the podcasts that Gordo would come out and pull half guard, and people would lose their mind, like, oh my god, what's he doing? He basically invented the half guard system that no one was prepared for because he was working around an injury.
Yeah.
So like in those kind of scenarios, like you say, with you working your guard and making that like a really big component of your game, it's realizing that, okay, so for example, in this scenario, it's a rib injury. So you can't play bottom so well, right? 'Cause you
Yeah.
put weight on you. But if you ask your training partners, oh, can I play top? Your passing game's going to get like absolutely shit hot, because you work, and your training partner should be there to work with you. It shouldn't be like, no, I want you to play bottom, and they want to smash you. If they're doing that, you're in the wrong place. You want your training partners to help you. You don't want someone that's going to break the toys.
But you definitely see that, don't you? I think it depends on your own mindset, but also the mindset on the others who are around you. And I think it is about that honest conversation where, look, I hate the thing when people say there's no ego in jiu-jitsu. No, there's definitely ego. Like, I have a massive ego, and I never want to lose a round.
Yeah.
So, for example, like we had this, we both had this flu. I came back training on Friday, and I'm knackered, and I'm so tired. And then the second any positional sparring comes in, I'm like, I suddenly find an extra like 60%. I'm dragging myself off of the mat at the end, and I'm like, well, it's my ego, because I don't want to get beaten by the people who don't beat me normally. And so that is a big component of it. But the thing from like the psychology perspective is, my view is, and I don't, this is about you, I'll always go into the session with some sort of objective. That isn't win every round. And if I can leave with that objective being ticked, that's the key, right?
100%. And that was actually, I remember Barber talking about this, plug for his podcast as well. So if you follow Barber online, definitely listen to his podcast, Flowing State of BJJ. Very good listen.
It is good, actually. I've come across a few of them.
I
like the
school
format. It's cool.
Yeah. I like hearing old school jit stories, like people talking about like back in the day. But he spoke about going into competition with a goal in mind. So approaching that kind of, and that's like next level, like you say, because obviously there's always ego, but realizing that the goal in the competition is not necessarily like, I want to test this, I want to see if it works under pressure. I don't want to just go in there and like try my A game. That takes a lot of, I suppose, humbleness to a degree, but also like willingness to learn. You put yourself out there, like, and like you might have like a killer guard, and you're like, you know what, I've been practicing my takedowns, I want to see if they work in a good, like in a competitive environment, so I'm going to go out and I'm not going to pull guard. You might have your chance of winning that match might drastically reduce if you try and wrestle the guy, because you might just give away 2 points and lose. But you're never really going to know if your takedown game has been improving to the point where it's serviceable, unless you put it on the line in competition at least once. And obviously I don't recommend doing that when you're at the highest level. Obviously you don't want to be trying shit out unless you're like Jeff Glover, and you're an absolute lunatic. Can you come out and figure out, play donkey guard or something like that,
But I think that's the objective, though, isn't it? Sometimes, because you've got to be willing to accept the outcome if negative. I remember after I just got my blue belt, like the imposter syndrome kicks in.
Yep.
So the first thing I did is I entered a competition. I was like, right, this is going to be two outcomes here. I'm justified in my position, or I'm going to get absolutely smashed, and I know that I've got some work to do. And like, I did perfectly fine. I was really happy with the outcome of the competition, but I went in there with that nothing to lose mentality. I'm like, I'm only going to leave the situation with a victory in some, like, I've got some direction after this. And I think you can apply that to your injuries, can't you? As long as you think about what the end goal is, or how you're going to come back from this, or, instead of, for me, for example, I've had 2 competitions in mind. That's just going to have to shift forwards 3 or 4 months, and that's okay. The plan still remains the same, right?
Yeah, 100%. And that's the thing. Like, you might have a plan specifically. All right, I'm going to do this at this time and this at this time. Things never run to plan. That's not just jiu-jitsu. That's life in general. Like, nothing ever runs perfectly to plan. And if your life focuses around everything running perfectly to plan, you need to get a helmet, because things are going to get pretty disappointing. Things don't go to plan. Life is messy, and more so when you're competing in sports and you get injured. There's going to be a lot of things that can make plans change on the fly. But ultimately, the overall plan remains the same. It's just the time frame that shifts.
So there was something. I think it was 2010. They did a paper on cardiac rehab, and they looked at people who had cardiac events, and they were observing exercise adherence in those groups. So you had to do a certain number of sessions. Excuse me. There we go.
There you got me as well.
a certain number of sessions a week to obviously get yourself to that level of fitness. And they had 3 groups. The group which was just crack on. You had the action planning group, which were the group who were like, right, here's the plan and when you're going to do the exercises.
Yeah.
And then you had the action planning and coping planning group. And the coping planning methodology was, if I can't do it today, i.e. I don't feel up to it, what things I'm going to tell myself if I'm not up to it? Or if I can't actually physically do it that day, what are my other options? How do I meet that demand? And obviously the action planning / coping planning group did the best.
Yeah.
And I think that's totally applicable to the things that we do is, if I know something bad's going to happen, which it probably is, because we do a weird sport, what's next? Like, what are the other options? Because I think we get deflated when our perceptions aren't met.
Yeah.
And so if we can quickly reevaluate what those perceptions are, we normally do quite well.
Yeah, that's it. It's like basically adjusting your expectations to what's happened around you or is happening around you. And then you find your happiness. I saw this video that kind of mentioned that in a different context, but it was basically like you're unhappy if your reality doesn't meet your expectations.
Was that Mo Godot guy? I
think it was.
Yeah, really cool.
Yeah. But the same thing applies. Like if your expectation is like, oh, I'm gonna come in the best shape of my life and I'm gonna smash all these comps and blah, blah, and then your reality doesn't match that. As long as you adjust your expectations based on what's happened, you got injured, so you can't compete to you. Then you're gonna be overall pretty content. It's that basically just mental framing goes a long way. One of the questions that gets put in my question box every time: how big is your Cory? So Tom, what are we working with?
Pretty average, standard. Yeah.
And this is a trick of the pros, right? If you're ever in a situation where a woman asks you, like, what are you working with or anything like that, undersell it. Basically, it's always good to like basically under promise and over deliver.
I'm going to tell you a funny story here. So, like I mentioned, I was raised a Mormon, and so the big thing about Mormonism is you don't have sex before you're married.
Yeah.
And so my wife, before we got married, I'd always say to him, like, it's like 2 inches, like, and you're going to have to be okay with that.
Yeah.
And to the point, like, fine, we got married, everything was okay, but I said, like, you've got to undersell. And she said she went through like my pictures of me in skeleton and lycra, and was like checking the lycra to make sure.
Solid investment.
Yeah. So I completely agree. Undersell.
Yeah.
Under promise, over deliver.
That's like it is like literally like a Jedi mind trick. So if you go onto the fact and you're telling the girl like you have the smallest dick in the world, but when you pull out your absolutely bang average, bog standard, unremarkable dick, it's gonna look like pretty good, and compared to what you've been selling. So yeah, that would be my advice.
Under promise.
Yeah, under promise, over deliver. You can apply that to all areas of life.
Yeah. So we're talking about perceptions and expectation.
Yeah.
Going to a competition, expecting to get wiped out in the first round, and you'll always be happy.
Yeah, exactly. That's it. Cough break again.
There we go.
Hopefully, by this time next podcast, we won't actually be dying. But again, if I put that expectation on my life, it might not be so happy if I still have this
don't do that.
cough.
Don't do it.
Yeah.
You get the flu again.
Yeah, to be fair, I've been on a run pretty much every 2 weeks this year where I've had the new flu. So
it's not good, is it?
Yeah, it is not. No bueno. It's not the move, man. So in terms of like what people have sent in, that pretty much covers everything, and obviously we covered the most important thing, like dick expectations.
Most important thing.
Yeah,
most
you got to have that. Like you got to have that wrapped up tight. So in terms of what's going on in life, obviously we've got Broken Matt launching tomorrow. I say that by the time I finally actually get this out there, we probably would have had Broken Matt episode 1 or role number 1 already come and gone, which I'm looking forward to. Obviously we're going to plug that a lot on our socials, so get involved in that. We've got the Dan Strauss seminar coming up at ours, which I'm very hyped about. Obviously that is the day after Polaris. So which is also going to be awesome. It's going to be a pretty good like jits filled few weeks, to be fair. But it is the thing, obviously, if you're watching this, you probably have some interest in jiu-jitsu, otherwise you've stumbled into the wrong podcast. If you made it this far, bravo, you're probably a jits fan now. But it is something that starts as a hobby and tends to kind of like permeate its way around to the other areas of your life, where to me pretty much like all of my friends are jits involved now, other than my friends in London, and I don't see them, so they're not in London, they're not up here, so they're pretty much dead to me now. It's just the way
it is. The north, the best.
And And I actually did lose a bet. Annoyingly, but not by long. It was basically I was speaking to Claire about when she was going to get her blue belt, and she got it not long after I'd put a time frame on it. And the bet was that if she was right, then I would have to call what I used to call dinner tea for the rest of my days. So now evening meal is tea.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
It's dinner to me.
No way.
Yeah,
See,
yeah.
see, if Claire, if you're watching this is a northerner.
Yeah.
See, he was on board with me, and you've changed my perspective.
So it's obviously I say breakfast, lunch, dinner.
Yeah, that was
Obviously,
my
like the intermediate meals in between, because
Yeah,
we
yeah.
all live in the real world.
Yeah.
Right, most important thing, if you were to get like a fish sandwich or a chip sandwich from the chip shop, what would you call it?
Oh, you know what? I think this is dependent on the bread used.
Okay,
So-
right, okay, we're going in, yeah.
So, like, since I've come up here, everyone calls it a chip butty.
Yeah.
But I never did. But back in London, we were very literal with it. It was just chip sandwich, and that was
Right,
it.
okay, fair.
And as soon as I come up here, everyone's like, "Oh, chip butty," and I was like, "What is this chip butty you speak of?" And I was like, "Oh, it's just chip sandwich." That makes sense.
Yeah, chip balm, some people call it.
Yeah, balm and bap. I've had so many different sects of Northerners like arguing with each other over what you call what I would call a roll.
Yeah.
And I've heard balm, bap, tea cake, bread cake. You know.
Yeah.
I just
No,
don't
but it's
get it.
dinner. It's
Yeah.
dinner in our house.
See, I feel sad now because I was on the right side essentially.
You didn't need to die on that hill, really.
Yeah, I put my faith in the fact that she'd get her blue belt, and she literally got it. I think it was about 2 weeks after, or maybe it wasn't that much after I'd put the deadline on it.
Yeah.
She got it pretty soon after that, and I still maintain that she missed the original grading day deliberately because it was within my
Well,
time
I think
frame.
there's some play there in that contract.
Yeah, I think I got shafted. Really.
If anyone who listens to this is into litigation or law, can we get that looked at, please?
Yeah, I do definitely want to contest the results of that one because I think I got the raw end of the deal there. You know, if you're missing grading days. So yeah, in terms of if people want to follow you, see what you're up to, where are they going to find you?
At Tom Walker Physio, that's simple.
Nice.
Or at Broken Matt BJJ.
Sick. Obviously, if you're here, you already probably found me, but I'm at B_strong_PT_. And I had to put those underscores in because one of my clients was like, "Oh, best strong PT is how I always read that." And I was
Best
like,
strong
best strong
PT. Yeah, that's fair. You don't want that, do you?
I was like, right, I'm going to have to change
I'm the
that.
best worst.
Yeah, pretty much. I suppose you want to be the best or the worst if you're going to be. You want to be the king, don't you? And at Hippo BJ, if you want to see anything that is a little bit more lighthearted, tend to share a lot of memes on that one. So if you want anything that is less professional, you tend to want to gravitate towards that. If you want to see like strength content or anything like that, obviously my PT page. Cheers for jumping on, Tom. Obviously,
No, thank you.
if I was going to find someone to do this with, wanted someone that I could nerd out with about all things. So yeah, I think it did pretty well in terms of like finding
cool.
like the perfect co-host. So obviously, I'm going to get this up before long. By the time you're watching this, it's already up. No promises on when we get the next one done, but we will see you at the next one. Cheers,
Cool.
guys.
Thank you. See you later.